Well, the topic of the talk is political betting regulation, pathways to liberalization. I definitely want this to be a conversation, so just feel free to interrupt with questions or comments throughout. But just out of curiosity, so I kind of know the group here, how many people trade on Predicted? Okay, so I think most people. And how about Kalshi? And Polymarket? Okay. Great. Well, I guess I have three big questions that I want to get to in the talk today. I want to give you an overview of where we are in political betting regulation, what are the ongoing deliberations and so forth. And then I want to talk about what are the main drivers of regulation, what are the issues and topics that are really shaping the space. And then I want to conclude with recommendations and offer some thoughts on how we as a community can move the ball forward and shape regulations in a way that is more aligned with the public interest. My talk right now is a very abbreviated version of a report that my colleague Solomon Sia and I wrote. So if you're interested, you can pull it up on your phone if you just go to coalitionforpoliticalforecasting.org. There's a tab for reports, and you can pull up the report. But just to give you a little bit of a background on me, so I'm kind of speaking here in three capacities. I'm the executive director of the Coalition for Political Forecasting. So that's a new advocacy organization that I've launched with a few colleagues, and we're trying to aim for the liberalization of political betting regulations with an eye toward the public interest. And then I host a podcast called Star Spangled Gamblers, where we focus on day-to-day political betting. And I'm also a retail trader, so I bet money in these markets. So in terms of where we are right now, this issue of political betting regulation is actually very dynamic, surprisingly so. It's very volatile. And the reason is that there are basically three moving parts that are all kind of coming together right now. So one is an ongoing lawsuit between Predicted and the CFTC. And I'll maybe give just a 30-second overview of what the CFTC is. It's not actually obvious. So, I mean, all of you know from just civics, there's the executive branch, legislature, judiciary, but then there's this whole group of regulatory bodies called independent administrative agencies. So they operate in this weird area where they're under the executive branch, but they are governed by a committee in Congress, but they enjoy in our system a very broad array of independence. And so for a variety of reasons I can get into if you're interested, basically political betting regulation and especially prediction market regulation falls under the CFTC. So what basically happened is in 2014, Predicted went to the CFTC and they said, we want to offer political prediction markets, but we don't want to get in trouble legally. So what can we do? So basically the CFTC and Predicted worked out a deal where Predicted told them, okay, we're not going to rule on the legality of what you're doing, but if you operate political prediction markets and you play by a certain number of restrictions and rules, we will give you what is called a no action letter, which simply just means that the CFTC promised not to take enforcement action against Predicted. Now, that basically allowed Predicted to emerge as, I would say, the most impactful market for Americans to bet on politics and elections. Now, the problem is last year, the CFTC announced that they wanted to withdraw the no action letter. So that has led to a lawsuit. And although now the lawsuit is fundamentally an administrative law case in nature, the outcome of the case has already and will continue to have a very profound impact on whether or not Americans can bet on politics and elections legally. So that's the first moving part that we're watching. A second major event actually just happened today. So Kalshi is registered with the CFTC as a registered entity. And their approach was a little bit different. They basically went to the CFTC and they said, we're a registered entity. We want explicit permission to be able to offer a market on which party will control Congress. and they wanted to have much higher betting limits, and they're also a for-profit entity as opposed to an academic or nonprofit venture. So this was a sort of a new path here. And because of Kalshi's application, the CFTC initiated a broader review of what to do about political event contracts. How do we regulate that? So the CFTC did an extensive review of this area, and just today they announced that Kalshi will not be allowed to offer these markets. So now I think you'll hear more from Tarek Mansour later on the conference, but now Kalshi has a number of decisions to make, and it could lead to another lawsuit. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then the third big moving part is the one that people don't intuitively think about, but I actually believe is the most important thing, which is the innovation in the political betting community writ large. And what I mean by that is basically you have new companies moving into the space. They're experimenting with novel regulatory schemes. They're trying to offer new ways of offering political betting lines. And then you also see the growth of the political betting community. And that has allowed basically for quite a bit actually of side betting. So basically informal betting within the community that has its own rules and regulations of sort. And Abi, among others, I think can maybe provide some more color on that later. And this is important because, of course, the broader landscape of where political betting is happening, how it's happening, that shapes the kind of dilemmas and circumstances with which regulators have to contend as they think about how to navigate these issues. So that's kind of a high-level overview. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts just about that part? Yeah, Clay.
When it comes to like the CFTC's review and Kalshi's application, like, why do you think Kalshi thought that they had a good chance going into it when I think in 2012 the CFTC ruled against Index and their similar, who's going to control the Senate and House markets, which the CFTC obviously ruled against them. So what was like the legal theory that they had that would sort of say, oh, the CFTC's prior order is not valid?
Well, look, that would be a very good question to ask, Tarek. I think that's one of the questions for all of us, but I can give you my own answer. So what Clay is referring to is in 2012, another company called Nadex basically tried to do what Kalshi is also trying to do. They went to the CFTC and they proposed actually not only congressional markets, they wanted to offer presidential markets as well. And at that time, the CFTC did a review and they said, no, you can't do it because this would violate gaming laws. Now, Clay's question is, okay, why did Kalshi go here again and try the same route? And I would be very interested to see what Tarek has to say, but my own view is that I think more so than a legal theory, I think they believed that the circumstances had changed in a way that called for a new review. Now, those circumstances, one of them are political. So under the Trump administration, there did seem to be more of an appetite for deregulation and maybe a more market-oriented approach. But another argument that could be made, one that I made in comments to the CFTC, is that, look, the economy changed. I mean, in the interim, you had this renaissance of sports betting happening. Our politics became more contentious. Arguably, there was more political risk in our economy, so more that companies and other entities had to think about in price basing and hedging, all of which perhaps gave a new rationale for these markets. And that was one of the questions that the CFTC posed to the public. They said, look, we already rejected this in 2012. Why should we rethink the issue? And so they got a lot of comments on the question. Obviously, they were not persuaded. But I agree. I mean, that is an interesting question to think about. Yeah.
What happens next in the predicted litigation? It doesn't seem like they're adding all that many markets.
Yeah, so I mean, right now the only reason Predicted is still operating is because they received a preliminary injunction from the Fifth Circuit. So what that simply means is that until the case gets worked out legally, the court has said, okay, Predicted can keep operating. Now, one of the things that we learned in the litigation with Predicted is that throughout this period where they had the no action letter, there's been a constant back and forth between Predicted and officials at the CFTC. And the crux of the question really is, if you look at the no action letter, which is public, anyone can read it, the original agreement was PredictIt can offer lines on, you'll have to look up the exact word, but the test is something like meaningful political question. But that term, meaningful political question, never really was defined. So there's been this constant question for PredictIt and regulators of what are the outer bounds of what PredictIt can offer. So I think what is happening is that PredictIt has the injunction, so they know that they can operate as long as the legal case is going, but they don't want to really abuse and stretch the terms of it like they have, frankly, in the past. So I think they're sticking to elections and other lines that are pretty clearly within the bounds of the no action letter. Yeah.
Did I hear you right that political betting is treated differently from general events? And if so, why is that?
Okay, so yeah, in fact, I meant to mention that. So the reason I'm using the term political betting, I think it's worth dwelling on that term, and then I'll sort of get to your question. So when I say political betting, I'm not referring only to prediction markets. Prediction markets are an important place where political betting happens, but political betting also happens in sports books. There's a lot of volume there. As I mentioned, side betting is a big arena. So the question is, why is political betting regulated differently? And the answer to that is that basically in America, it differs by country, but in America, political betting falls under a very complicated and complex web of laws and regulations. So at the federal level, you have gaming laws, you have commodity laws, you have Dodd-Frank, you have the Federal Wire Act. You have CFTC regulations, and then you have more informal forms of pressure, like members of Congress just voicing their complaint. And then at the state level, each state has the ability to make their own laws on this issue. And so far, every state in America prohibits in one way or the other political betting. That is very different from, let's say, sports betting, which is done at the state level. And unlike with political and election betting, states have reached different conclusions on how to regulate this. So, I mean, one of the things that Kalshi tried is that they went to the CFTC and they basically are kind of appealing to the CFTC to be regulated a little bit more like a traditional futures market. And that's why they were very keen on emphasizing the hedging and price basing rationale for these markets, even though most of the activity is speculation. But we can get to it later, but I think one of the dilemmas here is basically, as we think about liberalization and so forth, we're looking at a very, very complicated web of laws and regulations, and it's a real open question the extent to which the space really is tractable in light of these complexities. Did that answer? Yeah.
One question about the side betting. What is that concretely? Is that like OTC or private groups?
Side betting is literally, we're in a Discord group, and I think Ron DeSantis is not dead. Another guy thinks he is, and so we negotiate a bit, and yeah. And there's a surprising amount of money that gets transacted that way. Okay, so I want to move then to why is it that political betting is regulated the way it is? Why is it regulated differently in many respects from other comparable types of betting? And maybe more importantly, why is it regulated so restrictively? And why is the trend line moving in the direction of greater regulation? So if you look at our report, my colleague Solomon Sia and I, we basically spent 1.5 years trying to get to the bottom of this question, and we interviewed dozens of regulators, market operators, politicians, and we identified 9 reasons, but for the purposes of here, I'm going to put them in 3 big baskets that I think kind of get to the crux of it. So the first one, probably the most significant one, is simply overwhelming, near unanimous, bipartisan, long-standing opposition by elected officials and regulators. So if you look at the federal level, the state level, across party lines, there is, in the American political context, very strong opposition to the idea that there should be for-profit legal betting on politics and in particular on elections. And to give you a sense of how deeply rooted these norms are, if you go at the state level, there are, I think it's 27 or something, you'll have to fact check that, but a number of states that explicitly ban betting on elections, and in some cases, these are statutes that go back to the 19th century. So recently, like West Virginia tried to offer election betting, and the Attorney General stepped in and said, no, the statute from 1890, whatever, is still applicable. So there are these very, very deep-seated norms. I mean, as of right now, I think there's one member of Congress, Richie Torres, who came out in favor of Kalshi's proposal, but otherwise you've had basically overwhelming disapproval. And Sean, by the way, was instrumental in that, so you should talk to him at the conference. Okay, so that's number one. I would say that number two has to do with timing. So as I mentioned with Clay's question, there was this moment during the Trump administration where maybe it looked like laws and norms might be opening. There might be an opportunity for political betting with deregulation. And a number of things have happened just in the past few years that have really made this a difficult situation. So one was the transition from Trump to Biden. So not only did a new administration come in that was a little bit more inclined toward regulation and so forth, but along with that transition in power, two really big things have happened. One is the controversy over the 2020 election and January 6th and so forth. And that has really brought the issue of election integrity to the fold and front and center. And in particular, this has been a concern more on the left in the American context. And so now a lot of not only politicians on the left, but even grassroots organizations and public interest groups have a much greater sensitivity to the idea that there may be real threats to basically the sanctity and security of our democracy. And so the idea here, which has been voiced over and over again, I would say is probably the preeminent argument against liberalization, is the idea that if you open the door to political betting, this could pose a threat to our democracy. And then the other big issue has been concerns about economic security. And the FTX collapse in particular was a very important event here. But the other big backdrop, of course, is the volatility of the crypto markets and so forth. And so a lot of people, again, mostly but not exclusively on the left, basically think, okay, great, you open the door to political betting now you have a bunch of issues with consumer protection, with financial stability, and so forth. And then one just attendant consequence, too, is in particular because of the FTX collapse, that has caused the effective altruism community to take something of a reputation blow. And that has been very difficult because the effective altruism community has been a very important source of support for political betting, and one that has really put financial firepower behind this effort. So I would say that would be the second big basket of issues. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that. Yeah.
Are you done with like the issues of the CFT? Because there's like one other that I thought
Okay,
was
yeah.
interesting that's in the press release. So and I'm just gonna
Yeah, go.
So our new authorities would per se include monitoring elections, candidates, and countless participants in the political machinations that proliferate in the media and cyberspace in an effort to prevent manipulation and false reporting within the political system. And so the idea that the CFTC also raised was being an election cop, and so preventing insider trading by, having some sort of monitoring of people that work on campaigns might be a thing. Or again, like, what if Polly Market in 2020 called the election for Trump, and then how does the CFTC respond, or some other sort of way? So that aspect of being an election cop, both in terms of adjudicating it and the surveying of individuals, like what do you make of? Because that's one of the CFTC reasons. Yeah,
this is very interesting, and I'm trying to learn more about this. But basically, what happened is, again, the overwhelming opposition, the argument was basically that political betting undermines democracy because, like you said, it can be insider trading. There's a whole array of things. But when you look at comments from CFTC Chairman Ralston Benham, he really believes, he makes an additional argument where he basically thinks that because now you have this entire community of people in the American political system that cry election fraud, constantly. And he's referring here, I think, to the MAGA crowd, among others. What Benham said basically is, okay, imagine that we allow these election bets to happen. An election happens in November, and then let's say a MAGA group say, no, that the election was called wrong. There was election fraud. The point Ralston Benham is making is, now if the CFTC is sanctioning election betting, now they could be in this dilemma where people are crying election fraud, and they as a body have to go and investigate whether or not these claims about election fraud are in fact legitimate. Now, and so his argument is basically that this is not what Congress intended for the CFTC to be doing. My own view is that he's actually not reading this correctly. I don't actually think the CFTC would be in that situation, and the clearest evidence I can provide is that the 2000 election was extremely disputed. I mean, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. There was never a time at that period that anyone called on the CFTC to investigate these claims because of betting lines on InTrade or the Iowa electronic markets or whatever else. So I don't actually think he's correct here, but the point is that this climate and controversies around election integrity have, as Clay mentioned, raised more objections coming from regulators that are not only specifically about election integrity, but also about the authority of regulators and their capacity to regulate and police these markets. Yeah.
Well, what about betting on other type of political outcomes, like Congress passed a certain bill? Are regulators also opposed to that type of market?
So yes and no. So even on Kalshi, even though they've been denied election betting, they are allowed to offer other political contracts. And the sensitivity to non-election questions varies quite a bit. So some political questions are banned by law, by statute. If you look at Dodd-Frank, like you can't bet on assassination, war, there's a whole category of these things. On the other hand, there's a whole group of markets that are really not controversial at all. I don't know, an example might be like a science market that's sort of loosely related to politics. There are other, this has been a very interesting kind of revelation from the review here, that markets that I would have thought regulators would really want want to happen and see the public value in have been very controversial. So for example, one of the things that got predicted in some hot water with the CFTC is that they offered markets on the number of COVID cases. And like from my perspective, that's sort of the paradigmatic example of a market that is squarely in the public interest. Like, of course, we would want as a society to know that, but the CFTC came back to predict it and said that market is in poor taste. We don't want that. So, you know, this is, I think, kind of underscores that things that may be intuitive or obvious to us as a forecasting community were often miles apart from where the American political discourse is. But Kalshi is a good test. I mean, I think they are exploring in many ways, one by one, precisely how far they can go in offering political questions. Yeah.
Does the CFTC regulate like bets between big prop trading firms like Goldman and SIG or something that clearly are engaged in some of these bets on elections? Like who regulates that?
I don't really know the answer. I mean, I think that would be a good question for Tarek to answer, because I think one of the arguments that they brought to the table was basically that, look, you have all this political risk out there that is not being hedged and cannot really be hedged from Goldman and other financial firms. I don't know enough about finance or Wall Street to really know if that argument is true. Again, clearly the CFTC has concluded that whatever political risk is out there that aren't being hedged, that political prediction markets may not be the right answer to that. But I don't know. I mean, part of the complication here is that my guess would be that the SEC also is an important body there. But in terms of specifically political prediction markets, that is squarely in the jurisdiction of the CFTC. American Civics Exchange.
What is the filing of the CFTC?
So,
that's some in legal theory, I think, somewhere.
Yeah. I want to be careful here because Flip is a colleague and friend, but the American Civics Exchange is not registered with the CFTC, and they have not pursued registration with the CFTC. Flip maintains that they have the right to operate without registration with the CFTC. If I were giving them legal counsel, which I'm not, I would say that probably they ought to be exploring that, but I think that this is one of the reasons why the dynamic here is in flux, because actually it is a legitimate question which firms have to go to the CFTC, which don't, and even if in theory they have to go, do they face any real prospect of enforcement action? We don't know the answer to that question.
Sort of more general, but like, what do you how do you view the future of CFTC enforcement on prediction markets? I think it was 2 weeks ago. Ian McGinley said that, polymarket does stand for a fundamental principle that all derivative markets must operate within the law, regardless of legal structure or technology used. And then, this followed up right afterwards. Like, moving forward, like, where do you see how the CFTC action? It seems like they're, really clamping down on things.
Well, I mean, so this is what I was alluding to. You read a statement like that, which was an official opinion by a CFTC official, and that suggests to me that any of these firms probably ought to be pursuing CFTC regulation. At the same time, does the CFTC have the capacity to go to each and every one of these firms, even if in theory they should be registering, and take enforcement action? I think the answer is no way, not only because of their resource constraints and so forth, but even if you do pursue an enforcement action, if a betting site just doesn't have all that much liquidity, there's not a real opportunity to collect, to make it worthwhile. I think the reason why Polymarket faced an enforcement action, frankly, had less to do with their regulatory scheme and more to do with the fact that they just grew so fast and had so much money and so much activity during the pandemic that it was hard to ignore, especially with Kalshi and that review being at the forefront. How are we doing on time? Maybe I should. Okay. Yeah, we're fine. Okay, let me conclude with some thoughts on what we can do as a community to move the ball forward. And when I say move the ball forward, I mean partly liberalization, but really I would argue our interest should be not total deregulation for deregulation's sake, but really how do we create and craft a regulatory regime that really furthers the public interest, that allows these markets to flourish in a way that they add real value to society, that they improve our forecasting infrastructure, and so forth. What I would say is that I think the first is that, and this goes back to the drivers of regulation, is that I think a big part of the reason why we are in the dilemma that we are has to do, just speaking very frankly, due to the poor performance of the political forecasting community. And what I mean by that is that I think it's fair to say that over the past few years, the promise of political betting and political prediction markets has not really been realized. So part of the issue here is that if you look at prediction market prices, sometimes they've been accurate, sometimes they haven't, but I think that on net, I don't think enough people reasonably have concluded that these markets really are clearly superior to modalities or instruments that are more familiar. For example, polling or expert opinion or election models. So I think that just in terms of our raw forecasting ability, I think that we have to get a lot better before it becomes clear to the public that these really do benefit society. I think another factor here is just the advocacy efforts of the political forecasting community. I think that the constituencies that have an interest in this have been very loosely and poorly organized. There hasn't been a lot of funding, and as gifted as our community is at forecasting and predicting political outcomes, I don't think that we've shown the same skill when it comes to actually effectuating change in the political system. And so I think that one thing that will need to happen to begin to move regulations is that the political betting community will have to grow, and it will have to really organize and learn how to shape the political system. And I would argue that just given how entrenched opposition is to political betting, I think that really there has to be a very strong emphasis on grassroots activism, because until politicians and regulators really see that their own constituents, the people who are voting for them, who are donating money to them, that they really want this to happen, they have every reason otherwise to ignore the issue or just maintain the status quo, which is really restrictive. And so I can get into, in the Q&A, some of what that might look like. I think that the second thing that needs to happen is much more innovation in the space of political betting. And I think what we've seen over and over again in other comparable contexts is basically that when innovation happens at a certain speed, when a community grows, and when it's evolving, regulators are at an inherent disadvantage because they simply cannot keep up with the activity. And when black markets or quasi-black markets grow beyond a certain point, even if the laws don't catch up, you end up getting what I would call de facto deregulation. And although I would prefer an approach that emphasizes the rule of law and so forth, I think the reality here is that if political betting just grows, if the community grows, if more and more platforms come to the fore, if they're developing novel regulatory schemes, I think there's going to be, at a minimum, a cat and mouse game, which inherently disadvantages regulators and the government. And over time, I think if the community just grows big enough, there's going to be so much political betting happening that is just well beyond the capacity of regulators to even deal with, that we may end up getting a robust, dynamic political betting regime, even if politicians and regulators don't really want it to happen. So I think that that is certainly a potential path forward. I would say that probably the final thing that needs to happen is what I would call self-regulation. So what I mean by that is that I think a big part of why there remain stigmas to political betting and so forth just has to do with broader perceptions of who political bettors are, who political gamblers are. And I think that this is very clear if you look at journalistic accounts and so forth of the political betting community. Like, what is the number one thing that they tend to focus on when they talk about political betting? They inevitably talk about the comment section and predicted, and how even by the standards of the internet, these are like exceptionally toxic, right? And you know, and like we laugh because we all know it's true, right? Like, I mean, like, how can you even deny it, right? You know, and then, right, so I mean, that's just, it's kind of a silly example, right? But then there are other examples. I mean, we all know, like, the people betting large amounts of money on, like, ridiculous outcomes, like Trump coming back into power and so forth. And so the reality is, like, the forecasting community, the political betting community, it remains very fringe. It's a little bit counterculture. And when, like, people in our establishment sort of poke around a little bit, you know, they might even be familiar with the idea of wisdom of the crowds, and they might even generally have a sense of the public interest rationale, but then they look at the reality of the community and they don't like it. And so, you know, the good news here is that self-regulation is something that is under our control. It doesn't really matter what Elizabeth Warren or anyone else thinks about it. It doesn't matter if we like Kalshi's approach or their platform. It's something that is, you know, something that is in our control. We can work on every day. And I really think that if, as a community, we just reflect a little bit on the regulatory scheme every time, like, we post in the comments or, you know, we place a bet or whatever, I really do think over time, as our community becomes more oriented around the public interest, that is the kind of thing that can lay the groundwork for a more coherent, liberal political regime. I think I will stop there, and maybe we should spend the rest of the time on Q&A. But thank you.
Questions?
I think there are legitimate ethical concerns around liberalization, like workers' incentives created by allowing, you know, and like similar to like assessment markets, incentivizing people to, turn the election one way or the other, or turn the decision of the election one way or the other.
Okay, so I would answer that in three ways. Okay, so there's one set of questions that are philosophical in nature. I think that if you believe just as a moral principle that gambling is inherently wrong, then I think that there's every reason to oppose political betting just on ethical and philosophical grounds. So, there's a moral component here, and I think that's a significant issue to contend with. My own view is that I do think political betting is gaming and gambling, but I think it's very different from like an online slot machine or something like that. And I think it's a real mystery to me. Why is it that we have, especially now with the sophistication of these online platforms, you have some like really degenerate lines out there on the internet. So why is it the regulators are okay with that, but betting on an election once every 4 years is a problem? Right? That's one thing. I think the second element, and this is an argument that is voiced over and over again, that if you allow political betting, you create all kinds of perverse incentives that could erode election integrity and so forth. My answer to that is that these kinds of concerns are very intuitive and not difficult to think about in theory. But my response is that we in fact have an ideal case study to learn about this and look into it, which is the UK. Basically, since the 1960s, the UK has had essentially a free-for-all in political betting. It's actually shocking the extent to which there really are not laws that are governing political betting there. The UK, I think by any standard, is a sophisticated, mature democracy with very similar cultural norms to us. I would say Solomon and I spent a lot of time just looking for every conceivable example that we could find in the UK of politicians throwing an election or somehow the process getting corrupted. We basically could not find any. Like the only time where you really see political prediction markets being used for manipulation is that sometimes you will have an underdog candidate in a race trying to shape the narrative of the election. So they might throw a bunch of money into a market, temporarily spike the price, and then they'll go to reporters and they'll say, hey, look, you guys aren't taking us seriously, but look at the gamblers, they give us a 30% chance or whatever. But even that is not really effective, because the incentive then for smart bettors to come in on the other side and move the market back down is so powerful that it doesn't really work. And as these markets mature, journalists are also getting a lot smarter, so they're not falling for that that sort of thing. And then I would say, the third point on the ethical front would just be, okay, what is the alternative to legalization and regulation? And I would argue it's not that you can make political betting disappear. Really, the practical choice is either you have it in a legal, regulated way, or it moves to the black markets, where many of these worst outcomes are more likely to happen. Yeah.
Anyway, on that front, do you make any argument in terms of if people were betting on elections, it raises the emotional stake, and given the current tensions in the U.S., that would make things worse. So everyone on January 6th, instead of just thinking they lost the country, they're also going to lose their house because they put a lot of money on the polling market, and they're really hoping that the one with Trump still going to be in office on January 21st is going to fix their problems. And so, how would that sort of play out? And then also, I think the CFTC's arguments about stopping insider trading, what that might mean in terms of oversight campaigns. I know you mentioned the UK. Their elections are so different than ours. I don't really know if we can look to them for that sort of case. And so, and they don't have free speech there. But just how you, view that aspect of it too. Because I think that's not really talked about, but it seems to me, from a civics perspective, the implications of having insider trading oversight over elections and campaigns.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so I'll make a few points. I think a fair argument, and one that has been brought up, is that it's not just actual threats to election integrity from political betting that matters. it is also the perception. And so at the end of the day, in order for a democracy to work, people have to believe in the system, as we've, I think, learned the hard way with January 6th and all that. And so I do think that we have to reflect on, if you allow political betting to happen, even if there are, in fact, no threats materializing to election integrity, does that somehow erode confidence in our elections? I don't think so, but I don't really know. I think that's something for us to reflect on and think about. I think on the insider trading point, so this is one of the issues that Kalshi tried to address and that came before the CFTC. And what Kalshi said is, okay, we're going to deal with that by basically excluding whole classes of people from participating in our markets. I maybe have a contrarian view on this topic. I'll just tell you what I think about it. I think, first of all, whatever these companies say, whatever regulators say, I think there are real limits on how much you can prevent insiders from betting on these elections. So I think that if we are moving toward liberalization, I think we have to do so on the assumption that insiders who want to bet on these markets will find a way to do so. The argument I would make is that that is actually a development not to be feared, but to be welcomed, because if we are thinking about political betting primarily in order to promote the public interest, then I would argue that you're going to get better price discovery and more accurate prices by getting as many informed people in the markets. And then if these insiders, to me it's a win-win, because either these insiders have real insight that'll create more accurate prices, or they don't have good insights, in which case these markets will be a rare source of accountability for our elites, I mean, who as we know, routinely make wrong predictions. I would say one more point, too, I would make there. You mentioned the point about people getting emotional and losing money. This is also a very interesting thing that I found that was not intuitive when I was doing the research, is there's actually not that much money being bet on politics. So part of that has to do with the fact that in America, we have all these regulations and so forth. But even if you look at the UK markets in 2020, the largest bets that were being placed on Biden, for example, all the numbers are in the report, but offhand, I want to say the largest bet placed on Biden was something like 1.3 million, which is way more than I've ever bet. But the point is that when you're looking at the kind of money that people are betting on Wall Street or whatever, I mean, it's a very small amount of money. So again, for whatever reason, even when people have the opportunity to do so, they're not actually losing all that much money.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
See, there's a larger conversation on insider trading, and I don't know if you can, just because it happens now doesn't mean that enforcement, it wouldn't be more if there wasn't any sort of enforcement, but I think also there's trust in markets because at least there is an SEC enforcing insider trading. So then either there needs to be some sort of system to create that illusion in politics, which comes with problems, or insider trading is going to be part of the market that should just be accepted. But then why would everyday traders walk into a market where they know there's no even veneer of it being fair, that it's totally fine for insider trading to take place there? So then either you need a system which might not be effective but still has implications on how campaigns are run, or you just say it's a Wild West, but then where's the liquidity for people going to come from?
I mean, I think this is exactly the kind of question for our community to deliberate on. I think if we can figure out sort of a good, I don't know if compromise is the right answer, but some kind of a formula here. I mean, I think that would be a contribution our community could make for regulators. You had a question, yeah?
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned, a few things that we as a community could do. But to me, it seems like the fear that regulators have, in addition to what these two commentators said, is less around specific concerns that particular markets might affect election results, but I think more that it provides new means for people who wish to destabilize the integrity of democracy. So to me, it seems like unless you directly assuage that concern or that potential risk, they won't really care about the outcomes in terms of benefits. I think you have to address it more structurally. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right. I mean, I think this is the dilemma we're in, that every time these markets are being proposed, regulators bring up precisely the argument you said, that it creates incentives for people to do this. then people like me say, okay, well, maybe it creates the incentive, but then why hasn't it happened in the real world? And then there's the obvious response that right now there may not be enough money at stake, but if you really move toward deregulation and suddenly you have millions of dollars in these markets, could that create perverse incentives? We're in the position now of like arguing with counterfactuals and so forth, but to me, I just think that I don't think that anyone really goes through the hardships of running for Congress with all the pain and stuff that entails, or I don't think anyone signs up to make like $35,000 being an aide on a campaign because they're really looking to eke out that like $850, right, in a market. And frankly, like having worked on all these campaigns at varying levels, in fact, I'll just tell you, like when I was working on the Huckabee campaign, I was at the same time betting in the prediction markets. Even if I had wanted to like somehow use that knowledge or inside information to like manipulate a market or sway the nature of the campaign, frankly, I don't even know where I would begin. I just you would have to apply so much brain power and you would have to take so much risk to actually do what regulators are claiming is a risk that to me, this just kind of falls in the realm of something that makes intuitive sense theoretically, but is very hard to do in practice. But I agree with you that this is an objection that we have to answer. And maybe one way to research it might be to look at the world of sports betting, where you have massive markets. There's no question that there is some degree of price fixing and manipulation, but how much of an issue is it? What lessons can we draw from that for political betting? I think that would be a very interesting paper or research project for someone to pursue. Yeah.
Do you think there's a Robin Hanson sort of sacred versus profane thing going on? Like you mentioned a couple times that, for example, you gave the COVID example, right? And it doesn't seem like there is really an insider trading or some sort of perverse incentive, right? It just sounds like the politicians don't like people betting on grim sort of death, outcomes, and that's it. And if that's the case, what can we do about that? That doesn't seem like it's based on any kind of economic analysis of the situation. It just seems like people don't like mixing money and life and death scenarios somehow.
Can you maybe summarize, in one sentence, what is sacred, profound?
Yeah. So he has this concept. I don't know if I'm the best at describing it. Basically, he has this theory that people don't like mixing sacred and non-sacred cultural things. So people don't like there's the story about Jesus, evicting all the merchants or whatever, the temple. Because people don't like mixing religion and money, or you could probably explain it better than I can, but that's kind of the gist. And he has a bunch of examples throughout medicine and all these other fields that
Yeah. No, look, descriptively, I think you're right. And you can even, if you read the CFTC's decision that was released today, even though this was a very carefully legal opinion, you get exactly that vibe that I think a lot of the opposition, I definitely got the sense, not only from these opinions, but even just talking to regulators, it's one of these things where people hear about betting on elections, and then it just kind of strikes it provokes a moral reaction and a negative instinct, which then forms the basis of crafting logical arguments, right? In other words, it's not that people start with the logic and then, right? So I agree with you that there's no question that we are up against moral sensibilities that, by the way, I think are deeply felt in American civic norms and among the American public. I have not seen any good polling specifically on political betting, but my guess would be that American public opinion runs overwhelmingly against election betting, political betting. So, I mean, I think this would be another interesting research project, maybe like a psychologist with an expertise on moral intuitions or a political theorist. I mean, I think political betting and political gambling would be a very interesting test case, and maybe that kind of literature would help us crack this issue. Yeah, Sean.
One model on this is almost like we're going through all these things, and like clearly all of them are like individually solvable, but like it would clearly be a massive pain in the ass for the CFTC to figure out like how do we deal with insider trading, how do we deal with all these things, and it seems like a global problem is like there isn't really that much we can actually point to in terms of like why do we want this and like what is the social good that's coming from it. And I'm thinking of like Kalshi being like, oh, Goldman Sachs could use this. Well, that's true. Why isn't Goldman Sachs like submitting, you know, like statements in favor of this or like asking for this themselves? Like, how do we address this question of like what is the material value that is worth going through all this trouble?
Okay, I mean, I'll give you a, I'll give you a respectable and then maybe an edgy answer to that. I think the respectable answer would be is, in light of the Kalshi decision, what I would probably recommend as an immediate action item would be to look at the list of states that have specifically a statute banning election betting, and maybe pick one that we think might be the most tractable and go to the state legislature and just see what would it take to repeal this law. And that would be, I think the exercise of doing that would provide us with some more feedback and insight from politicians that are a bit closer to the American people ultimately. But I think the other answer is that I don't know that this is an argument that we can win simply by making the argument. I think to some degree we just have to build the community that we want. We have to have more firms, more betting, whether or not it's strictly legal, and just show through the power of our example that that the societal benefits that we claim can actually be realized in the real world. Until we actually build it and bring it to the fore, I'm pretty skeptical that just argumentation and reason alone is going to solve those issues for us. Yeah.
I was just, Clay had mentioned the risk that comes with people feeling like, okay, I've not only have I lost my party lost, I lost the country, but I've also lost my house now from betting on this and not going my way. And I just conversely, I always like to think that I kept 2 or 3 people from going on January 6th because I took their money on Predicted. And if you extrapolate that out to the whole community, I think we saved democracy.
I agree. No, look, I mean, there is a serious point here that, for every one case of someone maybe placing bets and losing money and ending up worse off, how many examples are there the other way where someone had those instincts, could have gone down the wrong path, but got into political betting and it changed their frame of reference and engagement in politics in a way that is constructive? That's a question that regulators don't instinctively pose, but I think that is a legitimate question. Maybe we can do one more question? Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Doug, why don't you?
Yeah. Maybe I'll sneak in one. It's kind of interesting to think about, what should the regulatory differences be. So one thing, when we think about, should we ban insiders? If we have a prediction market where we actually care about the outcome, say, what's going to be the outcome of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, there's also kind of a notion that maybe you want insiders to participate. Maybe you should actually subsidize the insiders. And so I don't know, what do you have thoughts on this, on how, when you have a prediction market where you care about the outcome, as opposed to the financial sector where the settings are a little bit different, how should this be regulated? Is there a case, actually?
No, look, I mean, I think there's a legitimate question of whether or not insider trading should be regulated at all in financial markets. My point is that, looking at it from the standpoint of political betting, the argument I would make is that whatever your view is on insider trading in financial markets, I think we're looking at a very different set of dilemmas in the political betting arena. The entire purpose here, the promise of political betting, is that we have this crisis of poor forecasting in our society, where some of the worst projections, the worst forecasting is coming from people in authority, the experts, the talking heads, politicians, all these people. And so, my view would be that we, like you're saying, I mean, my view is that the promise of prediction markets and political betting cannot fully be realized until we get so-called insiders and people in authority to putting their own money on the line. Now, maybe a practical way to solve this in a way that doesn't provoke regulation, maybe some entrepreneur can go out there and create a niche micro prediction market where the only people that can bet on it, or maybe some percentage of market participants have to be insiders, and we can see what would happen there. I think it would be very interesting, and my strong suspicion, and I'd be willing to place a side bet on this, is I actually think that the insiders, even if they have an informational edge, I think over the long term they would actually perform worse than the people at Metaculus or Manifold or whatever else. I just fundamentally don't think insiders are trained to make good forecasting, and that's why they are insiders in the first place.
They also usually don't have enough capital to actually move prices. They just profit from it, dishonestly, but they don't even contribute to prices coming that much.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because it's just hard to get liquidity trades. You can tell anybody, oh, I need this loan so I can go
I think we're. Are we? Yeah. Okay. I think we're at the end, but I'll hang out if people want to chat more. But yeah, thank you.